Virginia Clauser with DDMS. So Virginia, if you want to pull your stuff up, um, Ms. Clauser has over 24 years of experience as an analytical chemist. She graduated from the College of Charleston with a BS in marine biology and began working at General Engineering Laboratories, GEL, one of the largest single-site environmental laboratories in the country. She more recently earned an MS in professional and technical writing from Middle Georgia State University. Her career at GEL centered on LCMS MS analysis for perchlorates, explosives, and PFAS in a variety of matrices, method development, and quality control in a laboratory environment. Since joining DDMS Inc. in 2005, she has focused on applying her analytical expertise, to the validation and verification of environmental data, ensuring accuracy, reliability, and legally defensible data. And with that, I will turn it over to Virginia.
All right, thank you, Zach, and thank you to everyone that is attending today. Can you see my slides all right, Zach? Just quick check.
Yep.
Okay,
Looks great.
thank you. All right, so my name is Virginia Clauser, and I am a senior environmental chemist at DDMS, and I do third-party data validation. Today I'm going to talk about the challenge of non-detects, interpreting and validating low-level PFAS data. So in general today, when I'm referring to PFAS, unless I state otherwise, I'm referring to the class of chemical itself, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. There are many pieces of the puzzle that we need to solve to minimize human exposure to PFAS. We can all agree PFAS are harmful, and that's sometimes where the agreement ends. How much exposure is harmful? How long do we have to clean it up? How can we clean it up? How much can we get rid of? How much do we need to get rid of? And who is responsible? These are all questions that have yet to be answered, but one thing is clear, the data will lead the way. Data drives risk assessment, remediation, compliance, and regulations. To ensure that data is usable, it must be interpreted by those who understand it. You don't know what you don't know, right? And today I'm just going to walk through a few essential elements. So we're going to define non-detect. We're going to talk about some challenges with PFAS data, some common pitfalls in interpretation of the data. I'll go over a few real-world examples and the role that validation plays. So why should we care anyway about PFAS at low levels? They're low, right? Well, regulatory guidelines are ever evolving. And the takeaway is that PFAS are harmful in very small amounts, and impacts can be significant at very low concentrations. Here you see a table from 2024 by the EPA listing maximum contaminant level goals and maximum contaminant levels. PPT, or parts per trillion, is often measured by laboratories and reported as nanograms per liter or nanograms per kilogram, and are used in EPA water testing to monitor strict limits on chemical contaminants like PFAS. To visualize just how small 1 part per trillion is, just think about 1 drop of water in about 27 Olympic-sized swimming pools, or think about 1 second in 32,000 years. And you can see we're talking about extremely low levels when setting MCGL and MCLs. The MCGL is the level of a contaminant in drinking water in this example, below which there's no known or expected risk to human health. These allow for a margin of safety and are non-enforceable public health goals. The MCL, on the other hand, is the highest level of a contaminant that is allowed in drinking water and are enforceable. So you can see here we're talking about enforcing regulations for 4 parts per trillion in some instances. The hazard index you see on this table is a long-established approach that the EPA regularly uses to understand health risk from a chemical mixture. It's made up of a sum of fractions, and each fraction compares the level of each PFAS measured in the water to the health-based water concentration. Again, why do we care? Well, this is a DOW webinar, and Janice referenced them, and I'm sure everyone's aware of screening levels. So this is just another table from 2024 in which you can see the screening levels are also reported at parts per trillion or parts per billion for soil. In environmental cleanups by the DOW, regional screening levels act sort of as a safety tripwire. They highlight whether specific chemicals in the soil, tap water, or air are high enough to cause harm. You can see that these levels are low. Screening levels are used where applicable to assist project coordinators in defining project action limits, or PALs, and to perform risk assessment. And I just wanted to mention the Interstate Technology Regulatory Council, or ITRC. As PFAS regulations rapidly evolve and regulatory thresholds continue to tighten, things can get a little dicey. There are so many regulations, including those developed by federal, state, and international authorities for PFAS in water and soil, and even air, and they often overlap. Target analyte lists are growing as laboratory capabilities evolve to meet demands. Non-targeted PFAS methods are rapidly gaining traction, and the ways in which we monitor PFAS is even being reframed. For example, there's a push in Europe to shift regulatory requirements from individual PFAS compounds to PFAS mixtures. This recognizes that different PFAS pose different risks and takes into account how they affect the environment as a whole. The ITRC is a great resource for anyone that has anything to do with PFAS. It's designed to provide working knowledge of the current state of PFAS, and it's for informational purposes only. The science is moving fast, and instruments and methodology are improving to allow for lower and lower detections of PFAS. As the science moves forward, regulatory bodies try to keep up. All that shiny, new, low data means nothing, however, if it's not usable or properly understood. So here's a quick audience question. Just answer yes or no in the chat. Just polling to sort of get a vibe. When you see a non-detect reported in a PFAS data set, how often do you interpret that as a 0? So whether it's ND or a U flag. We'll see what people have to say here. Anybody want to answer? Okay, we got a yes, we got a no. Bunch of no's. Okay. Well, it is actually a common assumption that non-detect equals 0. But this is an assumption that can significantly impact how we assess risk, make decisions, and communicate results. And I want to encourage you to challenge that assumption if you were one of the yeses. Non-detects are often treated as 0s. In fact, historically, some risk assessments used non-detect equals 0 or equals half the MDL as a rule. Where non-detect doesn't actually equal 0, you can see how this would be problematic. Now let's take a closer look at what non-detect actually means, why it matters more now than ever, and how validation helps us determine whether we can truly trust the results. What does non-detect really mean? Does it mean 0? Does it mean safe? Can we rely on it for decisions? Non-detect means a target substance is either completely absent or its concentration is too low for the analytical instrument to reliably measure. It does not necessarily mean the PFAS is not there at all. Rather, it indicates the amount is below the established detection limits. Non-detects do matter, and how can we avoid getting them wrong? Remember, the concentration at which a sample is reported as non-detect is not static. It varies based upon the method used for testing. For example, method 1633 is defined as performance-based. Users must take into account this allows for method modification and flexibility. Additionally, each analytical instrument and each laboratory will establish a separate set of performance-based detection limits. Non-detect can also be project-specific, identified in the SAP or in the QAP. Detection and reporting limits can be kind of confusing because there's so many definitions and they're all misused and intermingled. It can cause unnecessary difficulties in creating environmental statutes, interpreting the legislation, and equitably enforcing laws. But since we're talking about DOW, let's review the terms as defined in QSM 6.0. The MDL, or the DL, the method detection limit, is a value determined by following a procedure which is defined in Title 40 Code of Federal Regulations. It's used to establish the detection limit for the method, and it's a statistical calculation. The LOD is the limit of detection, which is an estimation of the smallest concentration of an analyte that shall be present in order to be detected with a result at or above the detection limit with 99% confidence. This is established by the laboratory per instrument. The LOQ is the limit of quantitation. This is the smallest concentration that produces a quantitative result with known and recorded precision and bias. For the purposes of Method 1633, the EPA considers the terms minimum level, reporting limit, quantitation limit, and limit of quantitation to be synonymous. I want to help you visualize this because I just said a lot of words. So let me explain it in this way. I live in Charleston and I love to walk on the beach. So imagine that you're walking along the beach at low tide on the shell line, and you see something that you are 99% confident is something other than a shell. You lean down a little closer, but because you're still too far away, you can't accurately tell its size or its shape, but it's definitely not nothing. Do I see a shark's tooth? Oh, it's definitely a shark's tooth, but I can't tell exactly how big it is or what species it came from. This is the detection limit. Now imagine you kneel down in the sand and you can clearly tell by its shape, it's a megalodon tooth, and you can confidently determine that it's 2 inches long. Now I see a shark's tooth, a megalodon tooth, and I know what it is and I know how big it is. This is the LOQ. What about a medium-sized shark's tooth that kind of falls somewhere in the middle? It's higher than the DL, but you can't confidently determine the size or shape. A sample concentration between the DL and the LOQ would be reported as estimated with a J flag, depending on project-specific limits, which can change. A non-detect result is reported as anything below the detection limit and flagged as U. In this instance, you're not confident it's anything other than a shell or some sand. So you're not going and telling your friends that you found this huge, awesome shark's tooth, right? Non-detect does not equal 0. It only means whatever is present, if anything, is lower than the established detection limits. Why is PFAS so challenging? Okay, you just told me that if it's below the detection limit, it's not exactly 0, whatever. Let's just tell everyone that and they'll understand. It's not that easy. Uncertainty and variability will always be present, and the goal is to minimize. Each lab must perform independent MDL studies which determine specific detection limits for each instrument in accordance with DOW scope and application. These studies are performed in pristine conditions, perfect conditions. This is the day everyone keeps everything clean. The LOD and LOQ limits are also verified quarterly by each laboratory, right? Right? Okay, yay for getting your MDL studies done, but we have to remember variability can be introduced by poor instrument maintenance, matrix interferences, poor lab practices, including blank subtraction and data processing that weren't present when you performed the studies. The most popular current methods for measuring PFAS in a regulatory sense are 533, 537.1, and 1633. All use LC-MS technology, but they vary widely on QC protocol, prep process, and analyte identification standards. Also, all analysts are not the same. A lack of analyst training can contribute to poor study results. Even Title 40 states it's recognized that the experience of the analyst is important to the process. The tricky thing about PFAS, which most everyone is aware, is that they are literally everywhere. Everyone can agree there are even more PFAS compounds than the few currently regulated by the EPA. As regulations evolve and it's determined that lower amounts of PFAS are hazardous to our health, the need for lower detection limits will arise. That's great for us as a population. Greater sensitivity means lower detection limits, and the ability to quantify PFAS results at low levels. This results in laboratories reporting closer to decision thresholds as a result of modified methods and instrument capabilities. This is going to be hard for the laboratories. This also leads to more results which fall into a gray zone where context really matters. Once again, the challenge lies in the correct interpretation of data. When not properly understood, decisions based upon results reported as non-detected can lead to underestimated contamination or exposure. So we took the advice and guidance we got from Janice. We used the toolkit. We have a perfect QAP. The field team successfully collected our samples. We sent them off to the best laboratory money can buy or that we can reasonably afford. And now we have data. We already discussed the challenges of PFAS. Now I want to cover a few ways in which misinterpretation of data is common. Remember, we're talking about tiny amounts of these compounds. So small QC issues can be incredibly meaningful. The slightest issues can change interpretation of low-level PFAS. Validation and review by someone who is qualified to understand the data and follow qualification guidelines is essential. Working in the gray zone can lead to more uncertainty, but with proper interpretation, the uncertainty can be mitigated, and that's the goal. Okay, another just quick, let's get a vibe. Yes or no? Would you make a regulatory decision based on a non-detect without reviewing the QC behind it? So just pop up in the chat, yes or no. You just got to take that non-detect and run with it. All right, good. Oh, you guys are, of course, you're so smart. That's right. No. Okay. It's important to think about factors that make you feel confident in your results that you are going to use. Always ask yourself some key questions. Are your data scientifically valid, usable, and meaningful? How much of a chance are you willing to take that they're not? And how much uncertainty are you willing to accept in the decision-making process? Reporting limits. You can see in this table that reporting limit requirements can change depending on the project. This table is straight from Module 6 Data Validation Guidelines. Same method, same analytes, different interpretation of low-level PFAS depending on project reporting requirements. To properly assess the data, it's imperative that the project-specific reporting limits are, one, stated in the SAP, and two, are being used by the laboratory. The validation process includes verification that the lab is reporting results using project-specific requirements. Again, reporting limits. Raised reporting limits and detection limits happen and are acceptable in certain instances. Where reporting limits have been raised by the laboratory, there must be a documented reason in the laboratory case narrative. Acceptable circumstances for raised reporting limits include dilutions for field samples where the concentration was above the linear range. Using a reduced volume due to pre-screen or historical matrix issues for field samples during the extraction process, or using a smaller injection volume. These circumstances all increase the limits proportionally, reducing analyte sensitivity. Where not documented or reasonable questions need to be asked. So what happens when a detection or reporting limit is raised? Remember, a non-detect is reported when a target analyte is less than the DL. It's that shark's tooth that you can't 100% identify or measure. If you raise the DL or the LOQ, then that allows for a larger concentration or a larger shark's tooth to be reported as non-detect and potentially go unaccounted for. So collecting shark's teeth, you just missed adding a big one to your collection. But with PFAS data, risk assessment is affected. When not properly documented or explained, Raised reporting limits can lead to false assumptions about the data. And you can see in this example, the original reporting limit was 2, the sample was diluted by 10, and the reporting limit is now 20. So it is a direct proportional to being raised for reporting limits with dilutions. Blanks, everybody loves blanks. Blanks are analyzed to show accuracy and give confidence that the process is not introducing any unwanted PFAS into field samples. They serve as negative control samples, according to QSM 6.0. There are multiple types of blanks, and there's no hierarchy amongst them. All are important, and blanks with no detections are obviously the goal, or as Method 1633 states, freedom from contamination. Clean blanks prove that during all aspects of sampling, transport, and the analytical process, there was no unwanted contamination introduced. However, this is the real world. Not to be repetitive, but we all know PFAS are everywhere and are in everything. Contamination can come from lab consumables, sample gear, exposure in the field, degradation of reagents, solvents, standards with trace amounts, background PFAS, poor instrument maintenance, or even a dirty prep area. During the validation process, any target analyte detection in a blank will be evaluated. Action for blank contamination will depend on QAP, SAP, and project-specific guidelines. Typically, for any detection greater than 1/2 the LOQ, the blank is considered to be contaminated. It's not free. Interpreting the contamination, applying qualifications correctly, and adjusting sample concentrations using guidance provided and professional judgment is imperative for data usability. What is PFAS-free water, by the way? In accordance with Mod 6, this is a project-specified definition. It must be defined in the QAP and SAP, and you probably heard Janice mention it in her QAP toolkit, which is great. Okay, here's just an overview of some blanks. So not only are we looking at the results for each blank, we're making assessments about data usability. We're making sure they were analyzed and collected at the proper frequencies in accordance with project-specific guidelines and the method. So how many instrument blanks per analytical sequence is required by the method? How many per sample number? How many equipment blanks are required by the project per day? How many field blanks? Do you need a source blank? If using potable water on site, then a source water blank can be a potentially important input to PFAS data, depending on sample collection and decontamination methods. Without proper knowledge of these requirements, we have no way to interpret the data correctly. When out of specification, qualifications will be applied for blank excursions. We can spend an entire 45 minutes on QA versus QC, but let's not do that. Just wanted to remind y'all that quality assurance focuses on eliminating defects in the process, whereas quality control focuses on identifying defects in the product. Here, the data are the product. QC samples help identify contamination, confirm target analyte presence, and provide analytical accuracy and precision. The level of review required by the project determines how intensely the search for defects becomes. In the DOW realm, there are 4 stages of validation, and each builds upon the previous level. That is, if it's included in stage 1, it is also included in the subsequent stages. Assuming a stage 4 review is required, all QC performance will be evaluated, not only for proper frequency and being within acceptable limits, but also for proper peak integration, retention time, signal to noise ratios, ion ratios, and other raw data parameters as required to ensure proper target analyte identification. And of course, as stated before, no 2 laboratories are alike. We don't want to believe lab fraud exists, but it does. But there's so much guidance. How could they possibly mess it up? Well, we like to think it's unintentional. Maybe it was lack of training or experience. Maybe it's because skewing results yields less PFAS detections and the clients just keep coming back for those clean results. There are accrediting bodies that conduct thorough laboratory audits and certify the labs. This helps weed out the bad apples, but without due diligence, a client could unknowingly use a laboratory that has bad habits. For example, a lab that subtracts method blank contamination from sample results would be misrepresenting the true sample concentration. This is a practice that is strictly prohibited by EDQW, and it's important that the lab you choose to analyze your samples is aware of this. Some laboratories don't report to the required significant figures that you need for reporting, and this could skew results. And we are all humans. Sample amounts, dilution factors, sample IDs are often hand typed, and mistakes can happen. Or say a laboratory doesn't comply with guidance and does not analyze an instrument blank immediately following a sample with a concentration over linear range. The instrument blank is analyzed to prove the carryover from the high sample is not present. Without analyzing an instrument blank, how can you determine whether the detections in the following sample are truly present in the sample or are false positives? We like to think we can trust the lab we choose, but you need a non-biased party to ensure all procedures were followed and that there's no funny business. And the moment you've all been waiting for, the real world instances. So this is case study number 1, and all of these examples, there's 3. They come from a Method 1633A data review. So here we can tell that small differences in method capability or QC review can drive very different conclusions. The magic is often in the details. First glance, you see a field duplicate pair here, indicated by this P. And you look at the analyte value column and you see 1.2, 5, 1.2, and the results are the same. Cool. Yay. Sample and field dupe pair. Excellent precision. Wait, let's look more closely at the lab qualifier. We see the sample 001 has a U flag. U means non-detect. Non-detect means that the result couldn't be quantified by the laboratory. The reported result is the LOD value due to these specific project reporting requirements. Look again, the detection and the reporting limits are not the same for the sample and the sample duplicate. You can see reporting limits have been raised. For sample 001, and there is a 5x dilution factor. This is where investigation begins. You can't take these results at face value and just move along. A field duplicate sample is collected with a sample set to measure precision with both laboratory and field processes. The laboratory wouldn't address the differences in field duplicate samples, as this is an aspect of validation. Does the case narrative tell us why the sample was diluted? Was the 5x a mistake entered manually and in error? What's the percent moisture on these 2 samples? Can we detect non-homogeneity in the samples? We need to look at the raw data and compare the on-column results. In this instance, the case narrative does list that sample 001 was diluted due to pre-screen results to reduce matrix effects. And this example shows how non-detect can be technically correct but still misleading if taken at face value. There are specifically stated acceptance limits for the RPD between field duplicate samples. However, in this instance, an RPD would not be useful. The QAP should state how qualification should be handled in instances where one sample in the field duplicate pair is greater than the LOQ and one is less than the LOQ or reported as non-detect. Typically, professional judgment is used, and in this case, both samples would be qualified as estimated JUJ due to a lack of confirmation in the field duplicate pair. Small differences in method capability or QC review can drive very different conclusions. This example shows how non-detect can be technically correct, but still misleading. This affects data usability as both samples have a level of uncertainty and cannot be used to make any definitive risk assessments without all the pieces of the puzzle. Case study 2. Here we have an equipment blank, which stated earlier is an aliquot of PFAS-free water, which is subjected to all aspects of sample collection. Where equipment blanks are detected for target analytes, this indicates the possibility of cross-contamination. Equipment blanks are collected at a frequency determined by the project QAP. Associated samples would be those collected in the field, either the day of, or site-specific as specified by the project. Any equipment blank contamination will affect all associated samples. To the laboratory, this sample is analyzed just like any other field sample. They wouldn't apply any lab flags or make any narration about a contamination present in an equipment blank. Any associated samples would just be reported as analyzed with no interpretation. Again, magic in the details. So you can see these results here are above the DL. Here's the blank qualifications table per Mod 6. Module 6 provides specific detail and guidance on how to make qualifications based on blank contamination. This is the updated blank qualification table used by the DOW. Different projects will have different guidance. It's imperative the person interpreting your data both reviews and understands the guidance that you want and need for your project. Depending on the associated sample results, they could be qualified accordingly. Let's see how the application of these qualifications can impact some of our low-level PFAS data. So here you can see on the left the unvalidated qualifier or lab flag, and you can see on the right it's gone through validation, and now we've applied the validated qualifiers. After reviewing the data and correctly applying qualifiers, associated samples now reflect uncertainty and in some instances bias. The data user should have all information available, including the EDD with lab flags, validator qualifiers, and reason codes applied. Final sample results and qualifiers will be applied by the project team after assessing all pieces of the puzzle. In this instance, for sample 2, PFBA was less than the LOD and the U qualifier stays. PFPEA, PFHXA, and PFHPA are all greater than the LOD, but less than 5 times the blank value, and so they are qualified as estimated with potential bias. PFOA is greater than 5 times the blank and doesn't warrant qualification. Remember those DQOs that are somewhere in your project guidance and should be written into the QAP? These data quality objectives are important. This example used the high tolerance guidance provided by the EDQW. Depending on how conservative the project blank contamination tolerance needs to be, the project team should set acceptance requirements accordingly. The project team has the responsibility to set criteria based on the needs of the user. And here's our last case study. Stage 4 validation goes beyond the EDD and Form 1s. There are many target compound identification criteria that must be met for PFAS analysis. These criteria help eliminate false negatives and false positives by ensuring the peaks are properly identified for all target analytes. One of the components of target analyte ID is signal-to-noise ratio. This is the ratio of peak height of analyte to background noise. This calculation is processed by the instrument software and is reported in the raw data along with chromatograms for each sample. It's not something that can be recalculated in the lab or by the validator. A high signal-to-noise ratio is desirable because it yields more reliable quantification. The sample in this example was selected for stage 4 data review. In this instance, we have a sample with a reported signal-to-noise ratio of 1.4 in the confirmation or primary quantitation ion. The acceptance criteria states that a quantitative ion has to have a signal-to-noise ratio of at least 3 to 1. This means the peak responses are at least 3 times the background noise level. Now for this sample, all other criteria were met. The lab case narrative states the analyst judgment was used to positively identify the analyte. No laboratory flags were applied. Now remember, lab flags are not qualifications. They're only used to identify issues within the laboratory and should be used to assess the data as a whole. The failed signal-to-noise ratio represents a concern that the lab might have instrument sensitivity issues. Background noise may be too high, which may lead to trouble distinguishing target analytes and background interference. This may be an instance of lack of analyst experience, poor instrument maintenance, or there is a need for the lab to optimize chromatography. A stage 4 data review would include a mass tune check. Did it pass? While the signal to noise can't be recalculated by the validator, other target analyte identification components such as ion ratio, EIS and NIS recoveries, and retention times can. A close examination of chromatograms as well as any manual integrations performed by the lab should be performed by the validator. In this instance, using professional judgment, this sample was qualified as estimated J due to the reported signal to noise outside of acceptance criteria. In this case, the reported failed signal to noise ratio could be attributed to inaccuracies generated by instrument software because you can see a peak here. But from this small snippet of chromatogram, the validator didn't feel confident making that statement. Of course, this would be addressed in the data validation report as one piece of the puzzle. Since the validator decided that the signal to noise failure warranted qualification, usability would be affected by the application of the qualifier, J, estimated, and uncertainty would be introduced. Mod 6 says to consider changing the reported detect to a non-detect for any affected analyte with a signal to noise failure. And this is where the project team would have the final say when they take into account all of the raw data and all the pieces of the puzzle, including the J qualifier applied by the validator. Oh my goodness, there's a lot that can go wrong. Can I ever trust my data? Yes, using the right method for your needs, ensuring all parties involved meet or exceed QC/QA standards, are accredited, and historically reputable is step number one. Building a team that works together to provide usable, defensible, and accurate results is the end goal for all of us. Where independent data validation is required as a final step in the process, you need to use a trusted, non-biased third party. Just like you would vet a laboratory, you need to vet your data validation company. No matter which level of validation is required, experienced data validators use specific guidance to evaluate the data. In the instance of DOW, method 1633, that would be the QAP, QSM 6.0, soon to be 6.1, the EDQW data validation guidelines, mod 6, and the EPA method. These documents combined provide the framework for interpreting and applying appropriate qualifications as needed. Where guidelines are not specific for an excursion, professional judgment is used. What is a data excursion? An excursion is any circumstance in which some part of the data is outside of normal acceptable limits or protocol. Professional judgment relies on a blend of experience, education, training, and subject knowledge. I won't go into it too much. I'm sure Capri from Paragon will do a deep dive into that when she does her segment after lunch. Validation is important and it is different than verification. Verification is the process of evaluating the completeness, correctness, and conformance of a specific data set against procedure. Data validation is defined as an analyte and sample specific process that extends the evaluation of data beyond method and procedural and even contractual compliance. Validation reviews the analytical context behind the reported value, including contamination, QC performance, and data usability. It goes beyond what can be automated, including recalculations, raw data, and chromatogram review, and logical interpretation of data excursions. Validation protects defensibility of downstream decisions and helps to complete the puzzle. Once validation is complete, putting together the puzzle is then the responsibility of the project team. With the lab report, historical data, and the validation report, the project team can make a decision based on all of the pieces of the puzzle. Validation process helps determine whether a non-detect is reliable, limited, or potentially misleading. In the realm of low-level PFAS detections, validation gives confidence. Remember, the project team has final authority in determining data usability. Coordination with the validation team is encouraged for clarification, but final decisions always rest with the project team. So what do I hope you get out of this presentation today? Ultimately, non-detect does not equal 0. I hope, if nothing else, you take that away from this presentation. Validation provides the context necessary for confident PFAS decision-making. Do the reporting limits match my needs? Were they established correctly by the laboratory? These are questions that must be asked. At low concentrations, the question isn't just, was it detected? It's, can we trust what we didn't detect? Non-detect does not equal 0. Non-detect equals below method or instrument capability. Context is critical for reliable, usable, and defensible data, even when, and especially when, your results are reported as non-detects. Review reporting limits before drawing conclusions. Always evaluate blatant contamination in PFAS data sets. Use key C elements to judge whether non-detect results are reliable. Validation should provide a level of confidence in the data that can then be communicated to clients and stakeholders. And that is the end of my presentation. Do we have questions, Zach?
Yeah, thank you so much, Virginia. So in the Q&A, we have one question. So it says, is a case narrative note that dilutions were performed, quote, due to the nature of the sample matrix or due to the dark color of the extract? Both we've seen a lot, considered a logical reason for a dilution.
Yes, those would be logical reasons for a dilution, and when clearly stated in the laboratory case narrative and verified, hopefully the validator would have both original results and the reanalysis diluted results, and you can do the math and ensure that the dilution factor was correctly applied. That would be a reasonable instance for reporting limits to be raised.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I have another question just popped up. The
Okay.
earlier slide about dilutions indicated robust reasoning to be had. Does this reason need to be documented and justified?
It definitely needs to be documented. As far as justified is where you start to get into professional judgment. A lot of times, with these PFAS samples, they're not pristine, right? So a lot of water samples have particulates. That should be documented. And if that is documented along with the statement that the sample was diluted due to matrix interference or high screening levels, then that would be an acceptable reason for dilution. So an instance that maybe it's easier to say what would not be acceptable is just a sample that had a result within the linear range that was then diluted with no mention of matrix interference, with no mention of why it was diluted. And in that instance, the validator would probably go communicate with the project team. They would reach out to the laboratory and ask for more information. And that's a great instance where communication is everything between the lab, the validator, and the project team. An open line of communication can usually provide all the answers that are necessary to make sure the data is the most usable.
All right, thank you for that answer.
Mhm.
So we have about 2 minutes left in this time slot. Anyone got one last quick question? Okay.
All
I'm
right.
not seeing anything else come up in the Q&A. Thank you so
All
much,
right.
Virginia.
Thank you, guys.
Bringing those draft documents.